Fulton J. Sheen, God and the Intelligence. A continuation of Chapter 9, Evolution and the First Principles. Furthermore, has not evolution its law? Do not these laws preside throughout the whole evolutionary process? At least the law of evolution must be constant. Otherwise, there would be no evolution. Does not this law hold good under given conditions? Is not evolution an evolution of conditions, but not of law? Cannot philosophy study these laws in their fixity and permanences? The law of evolution, as it is called, does not mean that the law is evolving. In a word, nothing seems to render certain immutable things necessary more than a universe in which there is a flux. Evolution supposes that a reality, while remaining itself in a certain fashion, becomes another thing. It postulates the analogy of being. If all is in all, if being is identical with itself, becoming is impossible. In conclusion, evolution in the empirical order does not mean that the fundamental laws of being, that is, of thought and reality, are evolving. Grant that evolution is scientifically demonstrated. Then, instead of denying necessary laws, it presupposes them and is intelligible only in virtue of them. The error is to remain in sense knowledge. As if writing for the philosophy of today, St. Thomas says, because they observe that all bodies are mobile, and considered them ever to be in a state of flux, they were of the opinion that we can have no certain knowledge of the true nature of things, for what is in a continual state of flux cannot be grasped with any degree of certitude, for it passes away ere the mind can form a judgment thereon. This reads as if St. Thomas had the works of Professor Alexander M. Bergson before his eyes. The solution is to transcend phenomena and work with the intellect, which seizes the intelligibility of evolution. The intellect, according to its own mode, receives, under conditions of immateriality and immobility, the species of material and mobile bodies. For the received is in the receiver according to the mode of the receiver. We must therefore conclude that through the intellect the soul knows bodies by knowledge, which is immaterial, universal, and necessary. There is yet another objection to this fundamental law drawn from the idea of nothing. It runs as follows. Absolute being, according to the law of contradiction, must have as its contradictory absolute not being, absolute nothingness. Is this a reasonable or even a possible conception? Is absolute nothingness a concept which the mind can bring itself to entertain? If they were mutually exclusive, they would be mutually destructive. For if absolute not being were a valid concept, absolute nothingness would be an entity, and we should have to predicate existence of that which is ex hypothesis, the negation of all existence. In other words, we should have to admit that there was such a thing as nothing. Notice that the principle of the contradiction is used to show that there is no principle of contradiction. Can there be any greater or stronger argument than this for the statement that the principle of contradiction is the basic law of thought and reality? The argument of Mr. Holmes has as its inspiration 25 pages of M. Bergson, in which he seeks to prove that the idea of nothing is a pseudo-idea, because it is neither an image, nor a positive idea, nor a negative idea. He thus hopes to escape the problem of existence, which implied a nothingness or a non-being. Apart from more or less important misunderstandings of the real nature of the law of contradiction, and granting with Mr. Holmes that it is extremely difficult for us to imagine a nothingness, we pass to consider the backbone of the argument. what is the idea of non-being which is implied by the principle of contradiction? It certainly is the negation of the content of the idea of being, but does the negation of the content of the idea of being imply the affirmation of a substantial reality? In mathematics, the negation of 3, which is -3, does not imply another reality. The idea of non-being or nothingness, then, is not an entity, as Mr. Holmes supposes, and hence there can be no necessity to admit such a thing as nothing. A negative judgment supposes a positive judgment, but supposes only that. It is absurd to ask that another positive judgment supplant the one which was denied. To say that this man has no children does not mean that he has something else besides children. Mr. Holmes has this to say of St. Thomas: the standing still of the sun and the moon at the bidding of Joshua was a trivial miracle compared with the standing still of human thoughts at the precise points which it reached in the respective minds of Aristotle and St. Thomas. But if thought stood still at those points, and if the philosophy of St. Thomas has nothing in common with modern developments, how explain the fact that the modern misconceptions of the first principles of thought have their solution in the Summa Theologica? Can anyone doubt that this reply of St. Thomas to another is the answer to the objection just given? Not being has nothing in itself whereby it can be known, yet it is known in so far as the intellect renders it knowable. St. Thomas thus admits the psychological bent of the mind to conceive nothing as something. But on the other hand, he does not allow that bent to throw him into a confusion worse confounded by identifying a negation with a something. The answer of the angelic doctor is simply this: thinking an object existent does not equal thinking that an object exists. The ideal and the real are distinct. The naught of thought is not the naught of reality. The whole argument would never have arisen had philosophers considered mathematical zero. This is played within equations, which helps in a solution of physical problems. What is done by the mathematician with zero may surely be done by the metaphysician with non-being. From a consideration of the presupposition of modern philosophy, we pass on to more direct considerations of its major proportion, in virtue of which it denies the absolute nature of the first principles of thought. It must first be noted that a direct refutation of a philosophy which denies the first principles is impossible. The reason is that there is no other prior proposition in knowledge from which an inference may be made. The refutation must therefore be effected indirectly, because the refutation of necessity is indirect. Aristotle and after him St. Thomas believe that those who hold to such opinions cannot readily be disposed of them. If the major proposition of the modern philosophy is true, namely, if there is only change and nothing which changes, if change has no need of support, and if movement does not imply a movable thing, then certain consequences follow which by their absurdity nullify it. 1. If everything is movement, and there is nothing which underlies the movement, how explain our abiding consciousness of ourselves? We do not pass away with our thoughts any more than the bed of the river passes away with the flowing of water. We distinguish ourselves from our thoughts. We regard them merely as transient events throughout the permanent duration of our life. There are no thoughts without a thinker, no dreams without a dreamer, no volitions without a will. A new mental attitude or a new thought does not make a new thinker, any more than a new suit of clothes makes a new man. The importance distinction between the accident and a substance must not be lost sight of, under penalty of dissolving the universe into an irrational chaos. In the face of objection, some moderns have attempted to explain the permanence of consciousness by the metaphor of a melody. A melody is nothing but a succession of harmonious sounds. This is quite true, but we must not forget that every melody implies an abiding something which retains the successive notes. We would never know there was a melody until we could retain the notes. 2. If there is nothing that remains without movement, how can we distinguish the point of departure from the point of arrival? And if there is no distinction between the two, why should there be movement? The thing is already there. Since one thing cannot become another for the very reason that there are no things, then there can never be movement. There is nothing into which things could transform themselves. Hence, to say everything evolves is to say that nothing evolves. 3. If there is no enduring substance, then the least change is a change of entire being, and there are only continual creations which succeed one another. The past, as such, continues in fact to exist by continuous creation, and you have the absurd conclusion that which is no more is. It is truly, indeed, the philosophy of nothing which changes. 4. Motion can never be an end to itself. We tend to something. We never tend to a tendency. The object of the will, for example, cannot be the act of willing, because the object of the will is some definite end, as the object of vision is color, as it is impossible for the first thing visible should be the act of vision, because every act of vision is of some visible object, so it is impossible that the act of willing should be the end of the will. Every being of its nature tends formally to one thing, the eye to color, the ear to sound, the intellect to truth. For this reason it is impossible that anything should tend to motion as motion, because motion is disparate. They say that motion, which is disparate, has as its end a unity, is to say that motion is at once disparate and a unity. Substance is a primordial determination of being, and is required to furnish the reason of being of movement or juxtaposed notes. The substance is not like the core of an apple hidden away from the surface. It is not extant, as M. Bergson imagines, for extant is an accident. Movement is possible only on condition of substance. Denying substance, modern thinkers must therefore logically deny movement. Among the particular arguments against first principles, perhaps none is more common than that based on the immutability of essence. In the words of one of the modern philosophers, it may be stated as follows: the law of identity owes its importance to its connection with the doctrine of essence, in virtue of which it is the parent of an a priori proposition. This law affirms that every being is or contains its own nature or essence. The doctrine of essence is outcome of a purely static view of the world of our experience. The classes into which things seem to be divided are supposed to have been what they are today ever since the world began. But what if the nature of a being is to become what it is not, to transform nature, to transcend itself? In such a case, there is nothing left of identity. This argument is of great historical interest. It is nothing more than a repetition of a 13th century fictitious objection which St. Thomas argued against his own doctrine to make it clearer. The modern version of it is much less forceful, being purely hypothetical. Apart from the consideration What is to be said regarding the transformation of species? Can they transform? To transform may mean one of two things. It may mean that the essence is, per se, the term of the modern, or merely that something joined with the essence is the term of the motion. In the first case, the species is entirely lost. In the second kind of transformation, the species remains, just as we remain man amid all the vicissitudes, physical and psychological, of our earthly existence. In both of these transformations, there is something which remains, otherwise we should never know there was a change. In the accidental transformation, the substance remains immutable. In the substantial transformation, the prime matter remains immutable. Neither of these transformations offers any difficulty to the principle of identity. In both cases, each thing is its nature. If the nature remains, as in accidental transformations, it is still identical to itself. If the nature is completely lost, it ceases to be that thing, and it becomes that other thing, in which case the intellect allows it as such. When scholastics say that essence change, they merely mean that if a substantially change, it ceases to be that thing, just as if you add or subtract, example 3, from a given number, you change the number. If a cow should evolve into a horse, it is no longer a cow but a horse. The intellect is measured by things. It draws its knowledge from reality, and thus, even with a transformation of species, it knows things as they are. Veritas est adequatio rei et intellectus. The basis of the foregoing objection is made to serve as an argument against the principle of contradiction. After quoting the principle of contradiction, as it was correctly presented in a manual of scholastic logic, a writer in Hebert Journal says, "So far so good. But what if the idea of being, as the one idea that underlies all others, were to be superseded by the idea of becoming, the idea of an eternal procession of being out of non-being? In that case, what would happen to the law of contradiction?" We are tempted to ask, but what if it would not? We pass on to the source of this writer, namely M. Bergson, in the hope of finding some justification for the argument. In the latter author we read, "There is more in a movement than in a successive position, attributed to the moving thing, more in the becoming than in the forms traversed little by little, more in the evolution of a form than in the forms realized one after another. Being and non-being melt, therefore, into becoming, and the law of contradiction ceases to be a law of thought." This argument draws its strength from the ambiguity to say that there is more in movement than in the immobile, and more in the becoming than in mere being of a thing, may be regarded from one of 2 points of view. It may be considered, first of all, from the point of view of the senses, and secondly, from the point of view of the intelligence. In the sense order, the immobile equals repose and inertia. A being which moves is more perfect than a being which does not move. Under this consideration, it is true to say that there is more in the movement than in the immobile. But in the intellectual order, the immobile equals perfection and stability as contrasted with repose and inertia. It is that which is compared with that which is to become. It is the possessing of a perfection in contrast with the acquiring of a perfection. In the sensible order, the immobile needs completion. In the intellectual order, the immobile already possesses it. Hence, it is untrue to say that the intellectual order, the movement, is more than the immobile. The man who already possesses a fortune is worth more than Mr. Micawber, who is continually waiting for something to turn up. Constancy of the will is higher than the inconsistency of the imagination. Becoming is an imperfection. It is a state in which one is in potency to a perfection which is not yet possessed. To carry the principle to its highest reaches, God is the perfect possession of perfection, and is not in the process of attaining them, as Professor Alexander, the modern school in general believe. God possesses the plenitude. It is only imperfect beings such as ourselves who are the viators on the road to our proportionate perfection. No thesis in the philosophy of St. Thomas is clearer than that which asserts that all knowledge rests upon a single first principle. To it all other principles of thought may be reduced. Upon it all depend to their validity. Without it there can be no certitude, but only opinion. Whether we choose to express this absolute first principle in the form of an affirmation, the principle of identity, or in the form of a negation, the principle of contradiction, it matters not. The point is that unless our knowledge hangs upon this basic principle, it is devoid of certainty. Therefore, causality, efficient, formal, material, or final, must attach itself in some manner to the principle of identity. In the Thomistic view, the connection is immediate. Its very immediateness gives to the notion of causality the absolute necessity and complete universality of the ultimate principle. He who denies causality must ultimately deny the principle of identity and the principle of condition. It is to assert that which has not in itself and by itself its reason of being is its own reason of being, or, in other words, it is and is not under the same formal consideration. Causality is a conclusion drawn from the principle of identity. It is intelligible only in the function of being. The finite which is not being, but of being, is not being but by being, which is being, as one is one. Finite being acts only in the order of such a being. God acts in the order of being as being. Causality, then, is an affair of intelligence, and not of sensation, or will, or psychical experience. Sir Henry Jones sees no more than the empirical in causality, principally because he allows Hume to do his thinking for him at this point. Causality is a conclusion drawn from the principle of identity. It is intelligible only in function of being. The finite which is not being, but of being, is not being but by being, which is being, as one is one. Finite being acts only in the order of such a being. God acts in the order of being as being. Causality, then, is an affair of the intelligence, and not of the sensation, or will, or psychical experience. Sir Henry Jones sees no more than the empirical in causality, precisely because he allows Hume to do his thinking for him at this point. Causality, he writes, is an hypothesis or a conjecture relation. No one has ever actually perceived a cause. According to Hume, we can perceive only sequence. If the sequence is unvaried and we expect it to be invariable, we call it a cause. Experience teaches us nothing regarding the necessity of the relations of succession. It tells us that which happens, but not that which ought to happen. To define causality as an extension of the internal experience of the will to all the objects of our experience is also to miss the whole point at issue. Dr. B.A. Beetz says, genetic psychology leaves us in no doubt as to the origin of the category of causality. To this we answer that genetic psychology can teach us nothing about the origin of causality. To say it does is to confuse the consciousness of a cause with a cause. It merely gives a cause for us, not a cause in itself. Geometry is little interested in the formation of spatial images, so too metaphysics is little interested in the psychological origin of necessary principles. The sensible data is merely the condition of intellectual knowledge. But this notion has been abandoned by some modern thinkers. Now they say that the popular conception of causation as production by the exercise of the will has had to be supplanted by the scientific conception of the equation of causation as the interdetermination of phenomena. But the interdetermination of phenomena is the statement of a fact and not the reason of a fact. It is merely the result of a generalization of experience and nothing more. It is a contradiction to define causality by such a formula. Phenomena in themselves are undermined and unrelated. Causality is the inner determination of phenomena according to the definition of the inner determination of the undermined, or the relation of the unrelated, which is contradiction. It is not the will, it is not the senses, it is not an internal experience which discovers the efficient cause as the actualizing principle of the effect. The intelligence alone sees the reason of being. If sense sees the change and the succession, the intellect sees the reason of it. It does not make the least particular of difference, the least particle of difference. Then, from what kind of sensation we draw our notion of cause through the intellectual abstraction. Its value is not determined by its sensible origin, but in function of being. It is the object of the intelligence, not inasmuch as it is human, that is, as having the essence of material things for its proportionate object, but as having being for its formal and adequate object. The first principle of causality, then, and all the ultimate principles of thought, are not laws of the idea of being, they are laws of being. We know cause, and not the idea of cause. Before knowing ideas, we know things. The idea of a cause presupposes a cause. It is only by reflection that we attain the idea of cause. The difficulty remains always the same. It is a failure to distinguish between the sense and the intellect, having rejected the godlike faculty of the intelligence, which certain thinkers of the last century identified with reasoning. Modern thoughts find itself incapable of ever getting out of the multiple, the relative, and becoming the imperfect, since knowledge manifests becoming. Therefore everything becomes. Such is the argument. So impressed has it become with the evidence of becoming that it makes a god of it. One wonders if the worship paid to it will some day carry its followers to the same extreme to which it carried the followers of Heraclitus. Aristotle tells us in his Metaphysics that Cratylus, a disciple of Heraclitus, was so enamored of becoming that he concluded it was wrong even to say a word, so he moved only his finger. He did this because he believed that the truth of the thing which he wished to enunciate had passed before the words were finished. He could move his finger in a quicker time than he could say the word, and was thus more united with the universal flux of things. Those who have more idealistic tendencies have recourse to another objection against the principle of contradiction. The author of the idea of God, for example, in objecting to the proofs of the existence of God, has recourse to Hegel. Hegel has proved that there is no such thing as pure being. Therefore, the proofs for the existence of God cannot be based on the notion of being. The law of contradiction on this logic is merely the law of superior reason, but not the law of all reality. The argument of Hegel is well known, and can be reduced to this simple form. Pure being is pure determination, but pure determination is pure non-being. Therefore, pure being is pure non-being. Pure being does not exist. The use of the phrase pure determination, the two different senses, has won many followers for Hegel, who were unable to detect the fallacy contained therein. In the first proposition, pure determination designates the negation of any specific or generic determination. Pure being is not this kind of being. In the second proposition, pure determination means the negation of all being, and not a specific or generic kind of being. Pure being, then, is not the simple equivalent of non-being. The above objections make sufficiently pure a point upon which we have already insisted, namely the proper relation between the rational and the real. The real has priority over the rational. Being has priority over becoming. Cognition autem est posterior quam esse. This is the intellectualism of common sense philosophy. The principle of identity and the principle of contradiction, being laws of being, are also laws of thought. In its construction, it concludes neither the sensible fact of becoming nor the intellectual abstraction of the priority of being over becoming. Becoming is the intellectual order, is an imperfection. To say, then, that there is more in movement than in the immobile, in the intellectual order, is to say that there is more in the acquiring of a thing than in the possession of it. There is more in being on the way to Rome than residence in Rome itself. Stripped of all the metaphors of boiling teapots, gushing fountains, speeding trains, and translated into simple language, it means that the part is greater than the whole, or that the greater can come from the less. More will be said on this point when we touch upon the evolving God. Another problem now offers itself before we pass to the proof for the existence of a transcendent being through the application of the above-mentioned principles. Can these principles raise us above the phenomena to God? What are our propositions about God worth? Can we validly conclude that God is, by application of these principles to the visible thing of the world? Is God a reality, or is God a symbol? The answer of modern thought to these questions is quite clear. Professor Pringle Pattison has very well stated it in these words. The point is, modern philosophy is but little interested in God as the object of knowledge, but greatly interested in him as the object of experience. Presenting entirely from an external approach, the resting solely in the way of religious experience, philosophers deny any interest in God as God, but profess great interest in him inasmuch as he has a value for our lives. This is what we have characterized as the third note of modern religious experience, viz., God is to be designated merely intrinsically and in function of our own experience, instead of by the object which determines the knowledge. God then may be either of two things for the modern philosopher. First, he may be merely a symbol. He may be nothing more than the projection of our own affections, the creation of our desires, the generation of our imagination, or society divinized, or the sum of our ideals. In this case, in the words of Bertrand Russell, man worships at the shrine his own hands have made. Secondly, God may be more than a mere symbol. He may be a reality, a larger self from whom saving experiences come. But in this case, as in the first, he is still to be designated in the light of our experiences and with special regard to values for our own lives. Terms which we apply to things about us will therefore name him without any correction whatsoever. He may be therefore the president of a great commonwealth, the great tailor, the idealized commonweal, the democrat, in opposition to the bickering monopolists who will have no other God but me, as Mr. Wells puts it. Or he may be graced more properly as space-time, divinal, imaginal, and the like. Whatever God be, either that of pure symbol or a reality, he is never known apart from the relation to our lives in the sense that he is never transcendent to them. It is the voice of human experience within us, judging and condemning all gods, that stands athwart the pathway that determines and designates God. In fact, so dependent is he upon us that even though he be real, we must be said to help to sustain the nature of God, in the sense that God himself is involved in our acts and in our sense and in their issues. There is double proposition at the basis of the modern contention that we cannot designate God properly as object, but merely symbolically or metaphorically. The first presupposition is that we do not know reality. Hence, God is taken to be a symbol for reality. The second presupposition is that mind is the measure of reality, and hence God is to be measured in terms of the needs of individuals, the needs of the age, the values of our lives, and in function of evolution. Both of these presuppositions are false. The first because ideas are not pictures or substitutes. They are transparent. Their term is real, not the mental. The second is false because the greater is never to be subordinated to the less. No faculty measures its object. The eye does not determine the color of its object. The ear does not determine its sound, and neither does the intelligence determine its object, which is God in this particular case. To say our mind is the measure of God is to make the means determine the end, the object determine the faculty, the determinable determine the determined, the less determine the greater. But how can we designate God? Every being is one, good and true. These are transcendental properties of being. Although the notions of cause, intelligence, and will are not transcendental in the strict sense of the term, because they are to be found only in certain genera or species, nevertheless they have an immediate relation to them. Causality has a relation to being, of which it is the actualization or realization. Intelligence has a relation to being, of which it is the knowledge. Will has a relation to being, of which it is the appetite. Inasmuch as they are defined in relation to being, they may be less properly called transcendental, because under this consideration they rise above genus and species. Thus transcendental notions, along with certain others, for example, life and justice, are notions which, in their formal aspect, imply no imperfection whatsoever, although the finite mode of being which they have in creature is imperfect. Being, for example, cannot be restricted to any genus or species, neither can goodness, nor truth, nor unity. Everything that it possesses thus properties, and none to the exclusion of the others. They transcend all the categories, and yet are found in all of them. Other notions, which do not enjoy the same transcendence, are not free from imperfection in their formal aspect. Reason, for example, in its formal aspect, is an imperfection because it designates a progress towards a term and not the possession or the intuition of it. So thoroughly do these absolute perfections, being, goodness, and truth, rise above all imperfection, all genus, and all species, that so far as the thing itself is considered, which these names signify, they more properly belong to God than they do to creatures, and thus be first predicated of him rather than of creatures. If furthermore it can be proved that God exists, then there are certain predicates which of themselves imply no imperfection, and which may be used to designate him properly. We are thus a long way from defining him as a symbol or in function of the subject experienced. But how apply these simple perfections to God? Certainly not by pure verbal arbitrariness, which is solely equivocation, for such is merely a play on words. Neither do these names apply unvocally, since such predictions suppose participation in a common notion. The attributes of God and of creatures have not the same definition. But if the names cannot be predicated invocally or with pure equivocation, how are they to be predicated? Analogically, that is, by a certain proportion. This kind of probation, more properly called proportionality, is the relation between two things which have not a direct relation, in virtue of which one of them is to the other what the second is to the fourth. Thus the number 6 has a similitude with the number 4, in that the first is the double of 3, as the second is the double of 2. This kind of analogy can therefore be predicated of God and of creatures. There is the Thomistic answer to the difficulty that there is no proportion between the finite and the infinite, or between creatures and God. If there is no proportion between the finite and the infinite, it does not follow that there is no proportionality, since what the finite is to the finite, the infinite is to the finite, and thus it is that the similitude between God and creatures must be understood, namely that God is in the same relation to that which concerns himself, as the creature is in relation to that which concerns itself. Keeping in mind that analogy of proportionality, such as the prince is to his people, as the pilot is to his ship, let us return now to our transcendental notions. These notions, which in their formal aspect imply no imperfection whatsoever, are to be applied to the whole range of being according to the particular mode of its being. The substance is being according to its manner of being, in se, as accident is to its manner of being, in alio. This fruit is good according to its manner of being, as regard its taste. As this man is good according to his mode of being, morally, the same is to be said of the true, of cause, of intelligence and will. Now, if we can prove God to be existent, these transcendental notions should be applied to him according to his mode of being. There is nothing repugnant in using them to express analogically the sovereignty perfect being. Once his existence is proved, God will be intelligence according to his manner of being, God according to his manner of being, cause according to his manner of being, intelligence according to his manner of being. This analogical prediction, in virtue of which the created mode of these absolute perfections is denied of God, and the formal reason of perfection is predicated of him, is the solution of the so-called antinomies, the imperfections which attach themselves to the finite mode of being are purified in applying them to God, in order that they may correspond with his manner of being, because cause, in its finite mode of being, is an accident of being. It does not follow that it is necessarily true of God's manner of being, quality of subject and object which flows from our finite and potential mode of being is not predicable in exactly the same way of finite being. Add to this a further principle which is implicitly admitted by modern philosophy, namely, every being acts according to its nature. Every effect resembles in some way its cause. To cause means to actualize, to realize, to determine. And since no cause can determine except according to the determination which is in it, it necessarily follows that there must be some analogy between the two. If the agent is in the same species as its effect, there will be similitude of form between the maker and the thing made. As, for example, man generates man. But if the agent is not contained in any genus, there will not be a similitude according to the species or genus, but merely that of analogy. This is the positive foundation of analogy, from which it follows that there can be no impossibility in applying analogical notions to God. In the course, then, of determination of God's nature, the mean term is analogous. Such a determination does not imply four terms, because in major the minor, the mean term has exactly the same extension. In general, we can affirm three things of him. First, that the visible things of the world require a first cause, which exists per se. Secondly, that all the perfection which is in the effect ought to pre-exist in the cause. And thirdly, according to his divine mode of being, the perfections we attribute to God vary according to the communicability or non-communicability of the divine attributes. James makes the mistake of accepting only the moral attributes and rejects as useless the metaphysical attributes. He forgets that there are two general kinds of perfections in God: the perfection which are communicable to creatures, such as goodness and wisdom and mercy, and secondly, the incommunicable perfection, such as infinity and deity. According to the first kind of perfections, creatures are more like to God as they more nearly approach the formal reason of these perfections. But according to the second kind of perfections, creatures are more like to God according as they separate themselves further from the opposites. A thing, for the example, is more like deity as it recedes from the non-being. The metaphysical attributes, then, are just as essential for knowing and designating God as are the moral attributes. They are not scholastic constructions. They are based on the incommunicability of the divinity, as the moral attributes are based on his communicability. The complete and full knowledge of the essence of God is reserved for faith and vision. We multiply terms in order to clarify our knowledge of God. This is due to the fact that knowledge is primarily from above and not from below. Objects which are below us we can designate more simply than they are in themselves, but things which are above us, angels and God, we must designate less simply. Though we cannot know God as he is in himself, we have a knowledge which is more than a symbol or a series of metaphors. Such designations as space-time, divinal, imaginal, duration, great Taylor, president, of the cosmic commonwealth, and the like, imply imperfections in their formal aspect, and give us no knowledge whatever of God. On the contrary, they reduce him to a state equal to or less than man, thus professing to make God more known and closer to us. They make him less known and less human. As far as value for our lives is concerned, what thing could be less adapted to help our struggling selves than a bit of space-time? It cannot be too often repeated. We are not the measure of God. God is our measure. Objects measure our knowledge. We do not measure them. It is not our privilege to measure out the kind of God we shall have, any more than it is within our power to measure out the kind of object which will determine our vision as vision. When philosophy reaches a point where it insists that we need a new idea of God, it is time for us to make a philosophical examination of conscience. When man takes upon himself to measure God according to his own experiences and his own utility, he has by this very fact constituted himself a God. If there is any fitting to be done, it is we who are fit ourselves to God, and not God to ourselves. Our finite experience as finite experience is a very poor criterion of God. It is not God who is intelligible in function of our experience. It is our experience which is intelligible in function of God. God has no value as an object of experience before he is an object of knowledge.